Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my name is Laura. I have quite a broad-ranging background. I did a PhD in molecular and cell biology, postdoc in cancer research, a faculty position, followed on to becoming co-founder of a startup company. So all in all, that's led to a wide range of expertise, particularly down the grant. So, you know, I've trodden a lot of different paths over the years. I've been working as a full-time medical writer for about 10 years now. And I've been working with ScienceDocs for about 9 of those, initially as a consultant. And then for about the last year, I've been working full-time for them. So I've written dozens of SBIRs and STTRs of different types, and I've also, beyond that, worked alongside clients to help them manage their projects after funding. So to give you a little bit of more detail about ScienceDocs, we were founded out of UCLA in 2004, originally as a local support company, and since then we branched out across the country and indeed across the world. We really work as a full service company that aims to support clients in their goals, primarily of obtaining grant funding, but other support services as well. So some admin support, things like that. Generally, we aim to support clients as best we can using a team-centric based approach. So that involves, you know, subject matter experts, general grant experts, admin support, and everything in between. So to give you an outline of the overall webinar series, what to expect over the next 6 weeks, today is going to be just a general overview and introduction into the world of the NIH SBIR program. Then in weeks 2 and 3, those two will be kind of run back to back just to give you a deep dive into actually creating the proposal. We'll start with drafting the specific aims page, the research strategy, planning the experimental design, all those various supporting documents that you need. So in those 2 sessions combined, I'll aim to give you as much information as I possibly can to help you with the process. In week 4, we'll talk about basically what happens after you hit submit. So the review process, the scoring, how to understand how that all works and what it all means. In week 5, I'll actually be joined by a colleague of mine from ScienceDocs from the post-submission support team. And between us, we'll guide you through what to expect after you've submitted a grant. So Cobb, my colleague, will talk to you about the just-in-time process and the reporting requirements and anything on the administrative side that you need to know. And then I'll talk to you about how to prepare for phase 2 from a scientific standpoint. And then finally, in week 6, we'll move away from the NIH a little bit, and I'll give you just a little bit of brief information about alternatives in the SBIR process, specifically related to the NSF and the DoD. So let's get started. So today, this is just a brief outline of what we're going to talk about, the advantages of SBIR funding, just a general overview of the program and understanding it, and then the importance of what to focus on and, more importantly, possibly what to avoid. So advantages of SBIR funding. Why would you apply for this type of grant mechanism? So first of all, compared with other grant mechanisms and alternatives like VCs, you actually have a pretty good chance of success as long as you have a strong idea with a good market and you've done your due diligence. Unlike funding you get from some private foundations, you're not actually incurring any debt or dilution of your shares. Some of these other foundations actually work more on a loan system. And more importantly, actually, you retain your IP with all SBIR type funding. You're free to modify your development plan as you need to. If you need to pivot, say if the market conditions change, or if you get new data or say a more promising analog or something like that, you're free to modify. It's important for longer term funding. Having this kind of grant reduces the risk for potential investors. Your science has been vetted, and it's really just, I guess it's some level of validation externally, and there's a certain prestige to having these grants within your company. So the first thing you need to decide really is whether you want to focus on the SBIR, which is Small Business Innovation Research, or STTR, which is a Small Business Technology Transfer Mechanism. So there are some key differences. The first is really the partnerships with non-profit research institutions. So the SBIR, you are allowed to work with a non-profit institution, whereas an STTR actually requires that partnership. A common example would really be when a technology is developed by a PI at a university, and the university is still heavily involved with the research. Sometimes the PI might even still be employed by the university. In that case, an STTR is a common path to go down. And related to that, another key difference is related to the actual PI of the grant. So for an SBIR, the PI must be primarily employed by the small business, and that means at least 51% of their time must be covered by the small business. Whereas with an STTR, the PI can actually be employed at either location. Another important consideration is related to the budget. So with an SBIR mechanism, and most of what I'm talking about today is phase one. Let me just preface that now. So with an SBIR, only 1/3 of the research effort can actually be subcontracted outside of the small business concern in phase one, and 50% in phase two, whereas with an STTR, 60% of the effort can be subcontracted. So that actually does give you a little more freedom and flexibility in terms of your budgeting. And we'll talk more about budgeting in week 3, but as always, I'm happy to answer any questions as they come up today as well. I won't go into too much detail about all these things, but so another key difference is duration. So phase one SBIRs are generally shorter, 6 months versus 12 months with STTR. If you're considering an STTR mechanism, it is important to note that not all NIH institutes actually participate in that program. So you'd have to have a closer look and see. And also the budgets allocated to the two programs are not the same. SBIRs are actually more common. So they have a larger budget cap within the NIH. So how does the program work? So when you submit one of these grants, you submit it generally to what they call the omnibus solicitation. And there are 4 different program announcements for these, 2 separate ones for SBIR, 2 separate for STTR, depending on whether you're having a clinical trial or not. Aside from that, there are also contracts, which we're not really going to discuss in this program. They're a far more specialized thing, and they have separate program announcements generally. All the budget caps within the omnibus solicitation can actually be breached if you have an appropriate topic, what they call current topics of interest. So that is something else to bear in mind. So phase one awards, the idea of these is to establish the technical merit, feasibility, and commercial potential of the proposed research or R&D efforts, and to determine the quality of the performance of the small business awardee prior to or further federal support in phase 2. The phase 1 awards generally do not exceed $150,000 in total costs over either the 6-month phase 1 for SBIR or 1 year for STTR. If you successfully are awarded a phase 1 grant and you meet the requirements for going on to phase 2, the purpose of phase 2 is really to continue the research or R&D efforts initiated in phase 1. Really, depending on the topic area, often the aim of at the end of phase 2 is getting yourself toward IND enabling studies. So the funding for a phase 2 is based on the results achieved in phase 1, as well as in phase 2. It's much more important the overall commercial potential of not just the project, but also the company and their broader goals. With the standard funding mechanisms, only phase 1 awardees are eligible for a standard phase 2, although there is a direct to phase 2 mechanism as well that we'll discuss briefly in a little while. Budget-wise, the phase 2 awards generally do not exceed over $1 million in costs over a 2-year period. There is also a fast track mechanism, which generally combines phase 1 and phase 2. We don't generally recommend these for most projects because the onus on the reviewers is much higher. You're much less likely to be successful. The reason why you might do a fast track is if you're on a much tighter time schedule, because you're combining, you're essentially cutting out the delay between completing phase 1, writing the phase 2 grant, and submitting it and getting approval. So you can cut approximately a year out of your timeline if you have a reason to try and get that quickly. Finally, phase 3. We're not really going to discuss. This is your commercialization phase, which the NIH generally does not support. So when you're planning your proposal, the most important thing is to take advantage of all the resources that are available to you through the NIH. The most important of these is the program officers. People are often quite reluctant to talk to them, but they should always be your first port of call. They want to help you. It's their job to help get these projects funded. So once you have your aims page, the first thing you should do is reach out to the program officer and have a discussion with them. The NIH also offers webinars, which can be very useful, particularly if you're new to the world of SBIRs. They also have several how-to documents on the website. And some of the specific institutes also have specific resources. I would always actually recommend people to look at the NIAID website. They in particular have a lot of helpful documents, tips for writing different sections, and they also have quite a broad range of samples of successfully funded grants on their website. So that's definitely something that I would recommend everybody look at. Once you've done this part, once you've spoken to the program officer, read the omnibus solicitation and then read it again and again and again. There is a lot of information in there, and it's really, really, really important. This is just a brief overview of what the front page of that looks like. So the SBIR program isn't really not just about writing your grant proposal. The most important thing is you need your idea and you need your strategy. So before you seek NIH funding, it's best some serious thought to a true commercialization plan and what funding would require for you to get to that point. So this involves a lot of planning, consulting with experts at various levels, and also setting both short-term and long-term goals. So a particular relevance for this presentation is eligibility. If you're employed by a university, again, this factors into your SBIR or STTR planning. You need to make sure that you're eligible for the type of funding that you're looking at applying for. When you are creating your grant, writing a grant alone is not sufficient. You obviously need to be preparing a competitive grant. Not the same thing at all. So hopefully this is something that we'll be able to help you with over the next few weeks. Once you've got your grant, hopefully you'll get your phase 1 funding, then you'll get phase 2. And from there, it's really up to you. So the best way to get to these end goals is to avoid the most common mistakes. So it's really, 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 I cannot emphasize how important it is enough to understand the differences between academic grants and SBIRs. People like me see these same mistakes over and over and over again. One of the main differences between these two types of grants is in academic grants, it's all about hypothesis testing. That's your core rationale. That is not generally a core rationale in an SBIR. So if you write an SBIR grant like an academic grant with hypothesis-driven data gathering rather than product development with a clear commercial goal, that's likely to be reviewed as a weakness by the reviewers. And it's really, really, really important to make the difference between that clear. Any reviewer will look at an SBIR grant, and if it's written like an academic grant, then they will not believe that you will follow through commercially, or they will not believe that you have the knowledge to follow through commercially. The progressive structure of an SBIR is also a big difference. So the phase 1 to phase 2, and the funding levels are also different. The experience of the PI very, very much matters also within SBIR. So being a very accomplished academic does not necessarily make you an ideal PI in an SBIR. Doesn't mean you can't be, but excellence in running an academic lab is not the same as running a small business or developing a product and taking it to market or to a commercialization stage. So to get around this, if you're new to this type of world, it's really key to assemble the right team around you. So you'll have the PI, you'll have your key personnel like you would in an academic grant, but the big difference is your advisory board and contractors. They are critical to the success of these. Your advisory board should contain people not just who can help you with the actual A to B to C of the science, but you should also have experts related to the clinical area that you're targeting, as well as people with experience taking a drug to market in some form, whether that's biotech, pharma, or drug development as appropriate, depending on your technology. So subject matter experts in all of these areas is really, really critical to your success. So what do you need to consider before you start applying for these? The first thing, and again, this sounds obvious, but make sure that you're registered. So I cannot tell you how many clients I've had write these grants, tell me that they're registered, then they get to submit the grant and they realize that, say, their SAM number has expired or they never registered for one in the first place, and then they can't submit. So, you know, take the low-hanging fruit first, make sure you're registered, make sure you have all your registration set up, and I've included a link here. You'll receive these slides. So just this website here tells you exactly what you need to do to get that. So when you've got your registrations, you have your idea, you know what you want to do, you're going to start developing your grant. The key term that the NIH likes to use is your value proposition. And you yourself must have a really clear idea of what this is. The term itself can be interpreted in several different ways. So at a literal level, what is the value of what you're proposing? And there are several levels to that. What is the value in terms of the market, financial value? What is the value clinically? What is the value, big picture quality of life? And all of these things factor into value proposition, and there's no right or wrong way to cover those, but you have to yourself have a clear idea, because if you don't, then the reviewers will not. Your product concept must be innovative, just like it would be for an academic grant. But, you know, particularly as an example, if you're, say, doing a cancer grant and you're looking at an immunotherapy type molecule, you would have to really have a very clear concept of innovation, because some of those areas are getting quite congested. So you have to set yourself apart from others to show that there's going to be a market for you. It's really important that you're addressing an unmet clinical need, or that you're vastly improving on what is currently available. Is there a market? If you're a startup, do you have the resources to implement this? Is your plan compatible with the phase 1 to phase 2 structure? And what's the likelihood of success? I know that, again, sounds obvious, but both of the work proposed in the grant, but also of the technology in the big picture. These are all things that, again, you need to really have a grip on. So once you've thought about that, you've got your product, you know your value proposition, you need to decide where to target your application. So again, this is where you'll go back to the omnibus solicitation and you'll read it again for probably the 5th time now. And then you need to decide which division is most appropriate for. That's not always a clear-cut picture. Sometimes it may be fit in with 2 or 3. And if that occurs, then you speak to more than one program officer and you have that kind of in-depth discussion and get their recommendations about the best fit, the priorities. And there are sometimes unwritten funding priorities as well with all these different institutes. So you want to get a feel for that. And again, the program officers are your path to getting all that information. Once you decided which division, you want to look at the study sections. So all this available information is readily available on the NIH website. And then when you submit your grant, there are 2 ways in which you can try and ensure that it goes where you want it to go. The first is to fill out the assignment request form, and that you actually submit with your grant. And there's also a tool called the assisted referral tool. And this is, again, widely available. this is actually what the NIH uses to decide where to send all the different proposals. And what it essentially does is it looks at the text in your title, your specific aims page, and your project summary. It looks for the keywords, and then it fits those with the study section. So if you can enter all those different sections into arts yourself, and if the tool doesn't direct it where you want it to go, you can tweak your keywords just to make sure. NIH will generally honor the assignment request form, but they don't always if it's not clear why you want it to go there. So the assisted referral tool is an important way to make sure that it goes where you want it to. And then, as we've discussed, you have to decide which mechanism you want to target. So do you want to do the standard phase 1 to phase 2, fast track, direct to phase 2, and also the SBIR or STTR? Just a couple of quick words about the fast track and the direct to phase 2 mechanisms. So the fast track essentially combines phase 1 and phase 2 in a single grant. So rather than if phase 1 is a 6-page research strategy, a phase 2 is a 12-page research strategy, the fast track combines those into a single document. So you'll have your normal significance and innovation sections, you'll have your specific aims, the approach for phase 1, you will have your success criteria advancement for phase 2, and then you'll have your approach section for the phase 2 portion. And with both fast track and direct to phase 2 and standard phase 2, you also include a 12-page commercialization plan. The fast track is actually a lot of burden on reviewers, and the rate of success is less than with the standard mechanism. Direct to phase 2 is generally used if you have a more developed product, a developed plan, and you don't need that small proof of concept grant to get to phase 2. Not everyone offers direct to phase 2, not every institute offers direct to phase 2. So if that's something that you would want to look at, again, you would have to look at the omnibus and talk to the program officer about that as well. Again, talk to the program officer before starting anything. So once you have all that, again, use the information that's available to you. There are also email lists that email you funding opportunities. These are generally geared towards academics, but there are some potential funding opportunities that could be useful, and it may also be a way to find out about a grant mechanism that's suitable for you that actually falls outside the SBIR STTR program. So the big picture of this, again, before you write the actual full proposal, you need to understand your company and what you want big picture. It's not just about the one grant. So do you have one clear product, or do you have a pipeline? Do you have a technology that you're looking to apply to multiple different indications? What's your company survival and growth strategy outside of the SBIR mechanism? So can you attract and retain developers with only SBIR funding? Is that realistic? If you do not have sufficient technology development resources, finding and retaining funding can be very difficult. And like most things, you have to assume that everything's going to take 3 times as long as you think it will and 5 times the amount of money that you think it will. So you have your idea. How do you get to phase 1? Can you survive as a company financially during that point? In the lull between phase 1 and 2, how are you going to manage that period? After phase 2, what's your long-term plan? And you will need to know this for a phase 2 application, because this will be part of the commercialization strategy. So how will you get additional funding? Will you look to VCs? Will you look to additional grant mechanisms? Will you look for an industry partner? That is not always easy. Or will you bootstrap? Will you finance things yourself? And obviously not a lot of people are in a position to do that. So you have to be aware of the fact that you may need multiple of these awards to survive long enough to succeed. So as part of that, you have to be prepared for multiple cycles of grant writing, and a lot of it will not be successful. So you have to have contingency plans in place. Again, you have to consider other funding sources, whether it's VC, industry, other grants, and everything in between. So there are generally three scenarios. So there are positives and negatives of VC funding. And for most people that are, any of you that are affiliated with the universities, your tech transfer and IP licensing departments will actually be able to well advise you on a lot of this stuff. For venture capital, your value proposition is critical. They will expect large returns quickly. They will not be open to waiting long periods of time. Industry partners, you have to have a very high financial value proposition, and your priorities must align closely with what their programmatic priorities are. And again, it's a long shot, but it's possible. So again, you have to have a plan. So to close out this kind of general introduction, just to give you a feel for the success rates of phase one. So this is, if you're looking at the last sort of 25 years of funding, currently the funding success rate for a phase one SBIR is about 20%. It's dropped quite a bit over time. For phase two, it's actually much higher. So because you can only, by the time you submitted a general phase two application, your science has already been vetted. It's actually over 40% for phase two. So you do actually have quite a good chance at your phase two if you successfully get through phase one.